Hello, everyone, and welcome to Virtual Camp Lovehoney. But let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Zane. I'm a sex and relationship writer. I have a sex column at Men's Health titled Sexplain It. I also have a relationship column at Queer Majority that focuses on LGBTQ issues, specifically the issues of sexually fluid people. And today, my co-host is Dr. Megan Fleming. How are you doing?
Hi, Zach. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm always talking with other Lovehoney experts and love interactive workshops. So I'm really hoping we get a lot of live questions later that they'll put in the chat box. So I'm a clinical psychologist. As I said, I've been practicing 20 years in New York City. So I kind of say I've pretty much seen it all. I mean, because there is so much diversity here, and I really love New York City. I specialize in sex and relationships, and I'm sort of a media go-to expert because I'm known for my practical advice and easy to follow guidance. And so basically, passion for me is helping other people own their own pleasure. So I help people get in tune with what are the blocks or barriers, because I think we should all have a great life with great sex. Hence, my website is greatlifegreatsex.com. So if anybody wants to go there, they could definitely check out me there for the greatest sex tips. Awesome.
And so today we're kind of speaking about all the things we had wished that we learned in sex ed. I was trying to think, Megan, do you remember what you learned in sex ed?
To be honest, I really don't remember. But so I did I asked my today 17-year-old daughter, and I asked my nieces and nephews who are in college. So I basically did a little mini focus group because to the point is all I recall getting is the anatomy. And that's something I think I consistently was hearing, that one guy was really lucky. He had something in elementary, middle, and high school. I think most people at best get it once. And that it's really focused on what not to do, right? Like how to keep yourself safe, not to get STIs or STDs, and to not get pregnant. The role of pleasure, I'm sure we're all going to have a great conversation about that. It's what we really need to hear, and we don't get to learn it. Like sex is skills, just like relationships are skills. And so I'm thrilled, as I know you are, for these kinds of events that we can really help people on the path to where do they get those skills.
Yeah, I think a question I get a lot in some variation is always how do I get good at sex? And I always just say, practice. That's the key. Have more sex and you'll get better at it. But I'm thinking in terms of what I learned, I just got the hell scared out of me in terms of STDs. And just honestly, STDs in itself is a misnomer because it's not a sexually transmitted disease, right? It's an infection. But that was it. They just scared the living crap out of me for that. And that's the only thing I can remember. They didn't teach me about pleasure. They didn't teach me about queer sexuality. They didn't teach me about consent. They didn't teach me about anything. And they clearly are still not doing this, which was kind of also why I was so excited to kind of have this panel. Because it's when I initially got this prompt, I'm we can talk about any and everything just because we pretty much learned absolutely nothing.
It's true. And I actually wanted to put some statistics in here because when I was reviewing the book Girl Boner, it was one of the things that really shocked me. And that not all states, actually only 24 states plus the District of Columbia require sex education at all. And of those, only 22 require that it's factually, medically, or technically accurate. And I was just I don't even understand how in 2020 that's possible. So I sort of set that as alarming statistics that we should all really pay attention to, because it really is up to us to educate ourselves and really own our own health, well-being, sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see one thing, actually, I just want to clarify one thing that I saw in the question, which was what's the difference between STDs and STIs? And really, it's kind of the same thing. It's just in terms of trying to destigmatize getting, let's say, gonorrhea or chlamydia. These things are not diseases. They're bacterial infections. So calling it a disease really makes it seem like it is the end of the world, that it's something that is potentially with you for forever, when for bacterial infections, that's not the case. So right now, in kind of the sex education world, there's this push to say that it's sexually transmitted infections, STIs, as opposed to sexually transmitted diseases. But anyway, moving on from here, I guess what would be some of the major things, I know you said pleasure, but kind of that you would like to see currently discussed in sex education, Megan?
Well, I think first of all, that we can talk about sex, not from, again, what it isn't, but what it can be. And around that, even masturbation, self-stimulation, especially now in COVID, in some ways the safest sex is with ourselves. But I don't think, and again, my niece went to a Catholic school. She was actually taught that it's bad or wrong, right? And this is 2 years ago. And so, although it was with the disclaimer that everybody does it anyway, so like don't feel bad or guilty, which you don't generally hear happening. So I think just helping people recognize that what is sex, right? There's just so many ways, right, of giving pleasure with our hands, our mouths, sex toys, sort of our bodies, like limitless possibilities in so many ways. So I'm always sort of excited and wish that people got more of that education.
Yeah, and I just love this push where I hear masturbation being called solo sex. And I think there's something just kind of so beautiful about that, being like, yeah, you're having sex with yourself and this is a sexual experience. But yeah, I think one of the big things kind of in line with that is the fact that there's such a focus on like penis and vagina and penetration, or penis and anus. And that is the only form of sex. And if you're not having that type of sex, then you're not having sex. And that's the only thing. That's the only thing what sex is. And that is just so wrong, but also so limiting in terms of the amount of pleasure you can get. And I think it puts such a focus, for men in particular, and this happens with women too, but just so much performance anxiety because of that. Because if you think that this is the only thing that sex is, I have to get erect, I have to last for a long period of time, I can't, prematurely ejaculate, you end up having all this pressure, and therefore you can't be in the moment and enjoy sex. And then you also still might struggle. I mean, there's so many, even young men now, who struggle with erectile dysfunction because of that.
And I deal so much with that, and that could be a whole conversation. But I think to your point, it's cultural, right? Where we're so focused on performance. And I always say we're getting back to the basics of pleasure, because usually guys so right want to please their partners. It's like batter up the plate. They're choking because it's just like they're putting too much pressure, and it's a performance demand. And so again, foundation of arousal is relaxation. It's really helping people to relax and really focus on the intention of pleasure. And the reality is, I don't know, you don't know, we can't know how it's going to go until you're in the moment. But that when and if worst case, you might lose arousal. Like in my mind, maybe not optimal, but it's not awful, because people tend to avoid dating and sexual encounters if they feel like they're not sure how it's going to go.
And I think what I like to tell people is it offers a different opportunity. And if you look at it kind of from a positive lens, because, I was something where I had such performance anxiety in like my late teens and early 20s. And when I was able to kind of take the pressure off, first of all, by communicating with my partner and being like, hey, this is something that I struggle with. I just want to let you know that this is my issue. Because I think some of the negative feedback that I received is when people thought like, oh, you don't find me attractive. Am I doing something wrong? And because of that, they'll end up lashing out, right? They'll end up being angry at you and saying, what's wrong with you? And I've had a few of those like really traumatizing experiences. But when I was able to communicate like, hey, this is sometimes that happens. I can't get erect. That has nothing to do with you. And usually it goes away after the first couple times we hook up. This is no longer a problem. But then what would happen was those first few times we hooked up, we would have such an incredible sexual experience. When that pressure was off the table, when I was able to focus more, and at the time, I didn't even know like how important clitoral stimulation was, because that was, again, something I did not learn in sex ed. And that was something I really just thought it was like, you jackhammer as hard as possible, because that's what they do in porn, and that's my only education that I had. But through this, I was able to learn like, okay, clitoral stimulation is so important. And in fact, most women cannot orgasm without clitoral stimulation. So I would start focusing on those things, focusing more on oral sex, focusing on all these other things. And before I knew it, all these other things that were not penetration ended up becoming part of my regular sex routine, even when I could get erect. And I think there's such beauty in being like, hey, this is actually an opportunity for you, because you can't have this type of sex. You can explore sex toys, you can explore oral, you can explore digital, you can explore kink, BDSM. There's so many more options that I guess we just didn't learn.
And I think that's really such a key a few points, but that we get to expand our repertoire, because many couples fall into scripted sex. It gets very rote and routine. And that's why the occasional sex toy is some novelty. But also, as you said, like our biggest sex organs are mind, but our biggest organs are skin, head to toe. Most couples, again, are focusing genitally, right? They're not focusing on the ear, the nape of the neck, the lower back, the inner thigh. Like there's so many erogenous zones, and we certainly can learn so much from Tantra in that regard. And going back to what you said earlier, is taking the pressure off as a sex therapist. If there's any difficulties with arousal, first thing we do is say, penetration's off the table, because I want to extinguish those intrusive thoughts that are spectating and observing. I sort of say there's nothing erotic, right, about that inner dialogue. And we can sort of make light of it, but also be like, okay, so how do we shift our attention? Because, nothing has to happen.
Yeah, and just realizing it's not the end of the world. I think, especially when this happens to you, and if you have some negative experience with someone, like, you just really think like it influences your manlyhood. You're not a man, you're inept, you're inadequate. All like this really, it doesn't speak to all these things about who you are as a person, but it's so amazing how quickly your brain will go there.
Well, I think this is really an opportunity for us to say, if you're a partner and if you're with somebody who has any challenge, whether it's with low desire or difficulties getting aroused or maintain arousal, it's really important how we respond, because oftentimes we come from a place of frustration or disappointment, not from a sort of a wish and a longing, and it can be really damaging. I actually heard someone yesterday tell me that their niece at 14 went and got basically access to a credit card and not telling her parents. Actually, as I say that, maybe it was like 16, but she was able to get a labiaplasty. And so the point is like, because one guy made her feel like her labia were too big, right? And it's not what we see in porn. And it's so important that I think as women, we see the vulvas come in all shapes and sizes, and that we're not shamed. Like, unfortunately, shame is such a part of messaging, and that we don't harm, we do no harm to our partners, and recognizing, again, the beauty of who we are as we are, because labiaplasties are up like 45% since 2005 and 16. Which is, wow. Requests come in as young as the age of 9. So it's really something that I think we really need to educate and let people know about. It speaks to the larger conversation of shame. And I wish they just normalized sexual desires in terms of, kink and BDSM, and recognizing that it's almost more normal to have kinks and fetishes than to not have kinks and fetishes. It really is. And instead, they didn't touch on that, I feel like, at all. And there's so I'm sure you get this all the time, but like one of the most common things I get is, am I normal? Is this normal? Is this healthy? And I honestly think 99% of the time, I'm like, you are completely normal. You're completely healthy. Oh, you have a they'll also think their fetishes or kinks are super intense. And I just want to be like, that's honestly not even that intense at all. But I don't say that. I just say this is completely normal. You will find people who are into it as well. And, I wish they taught us that, but also like how to communicate your fetishes and desires to your partners without shame. Well, and as you're saying, not only how to communicate it without shame, but how to have them without shame or shutting them down. Right? As you said, it's such a powerful thing to normalize a person's experience. Michael Bader wrote a great book on this called The Secret Logic of Sexual Arousal. And he sort of talks about some of the underpinnings, sort of psychologically, about what can lead to certain sort of fetishes. But at the same time, I think there's such pathology historically, even in the psychiatric community, like even homosexuality once was in the DSM. And so I think we've grown so far sort of in the psychiatric community in that regard. But as we're talking from a sex ed perspective, we're not doing kink, we're not doing LGBTQ, we're not talking about fantasies, we're not talking about solo sex or pleasure. Like, I feel like we're not giving even the ABCs, right, of sex education. And I think, sorry, I'm changing my camera here. I think it's also recognizing that it's not just like a strict matter of pleasure. And even though we obviously want to shift the focus to pleasure, but it's like the end game isn't necessarily just pleasure in and of itself, but it's recognizing that when you have a sexually fulfilled life with a lot of pleasure,
how this impacts your emotional well-being, how this impacts your mental well-being, how it impacts your relationships, how it impacts work, how it really impacts all sectors of your life. Sex is not this, it's not this one act that just remains in the bedroom. It affects everything without sounding too hyperbolic. And so this is why it's so important. This is why pleasure is so important. And I think if they had better explained that, being like, okay, this sex is going to play a huge role in your life. And for me, as a queer man, like, it's so much a part of my identity. As someone who's ethically non-monogamous, that's a part of my identity. As someone who's into kink BDSM, that's part of my identity. So, like, it extends so much further than just what goes on inside the bedroom.
Right. And I think, as you're saying, that it's like empowering people to explore, right, their turn-ons and not let sort of that shame piece get in the way. And just recognizing, most of us don't see it as, we have these expressions like monogamy equals monotony. And I'm like, well, it kind of depends on how you do it, because if you're always, I see pleasure, play, sex is that adult opportunity for play that we often don't get. And so again, sex toys, like, there's so many ways, really getting creative, fantasy, exploring fantasy, turn-ons, like, and I think that it starts with, how do you have these conversations? Because they're often difficult to have. So one of the things I often say is, well, I read it in Men's Health or Esquire or Cosmo that, what do you think of that? I kind of might want to try that, or that kind of speaks to me. Like, there's sort of safe ways to introduce a conversation where you're using some external resource as a way of saying, what do you think of that? And sort of introducing these conversations, because this is the thing about anxiety. It's always about the future, and it's never as bad as we think it is. We always project how our partner, like, they're not going to handle it, or it's going to be too much. And like I said, I've been doing it 20 years. I would say almost ubiquitously, people are like, it was so much easier than I thought, and it went so much better than I thought. And it's like, that is a huge take-home message, to not avoid these opportunities because you think something's going to be difficult.
And I think so many times when people are afraid of having these conversations, like, their partner often was feeling the same way. And if they weren't necessarily feeling the same way, they were significantly more open to it than they previously thought. But, which is kind of exactly what you said. But it's just, it's interesting, it's just seeing, I'm trying to think, what am I trying to say here? Yeah, I think just having these conversations are so important, really. Yeah.
Well, and that hopefully by people listening to this, they recognize we all got a disservice, right? That we really weren't taught the potential of what sex can be in our lives. And you brought up a huge point, which is our quality of lives, right? Stress is sort of the number one libido killer, but it's also what leads to disease, right? And so when you realize having an orgasm releases tension, it helps people fall asleep, like solo play or with your partner because of the prolactin, like, they say an apple a day, I'm like, an orgasm a day, right? Like, there's so many benefits to your heart, to your sleep, to your autoimmune, to pain, like, it goes on and on. And so I think the more we educate ourselves about those things, the more we're like, I want that.
Yeah, absolutely. And
that's aliveness, right? That's vitality. Sex is vitality to me. Like,
it's just realizing, there's so many more options than what we're doing. So when you kind of made the joke about monogamy is monotony, like, that's just not true. Like, that's not true at all. Like, there's always something new that you can try. And by the time you try all those new things, you can go back to the first thing, and by then that's no longer going to be stale again.
I want to just highlight a colleague of mine, Dagmar O'Connor. She once said, like, people are like, oh, I have 20 years. I'm married 20 years. Like, oh, you get sick of your partner. I'm like, isn't it interesting? You never get tired of your own hand. And that's what Dagmar said. And I was like, whoa, like, mind blown, right? It's really so much about mindset and perspective.
And if you're someone who realizes that, okay, potentially I need to have multiple partners, for different needs, whatever it is, and I can't have one person that satisfies all my sexual needs, that's when ethical non-monogamy comes into play. That's when polyamory comes into play. That's when open relationships come into play. And I wish those were things, I think that would have been so huge if I had just learned that, like, hey, there's so many different types of relationships you can have, and they're all valid and they're all equal. something I know that is very common with people in open relationships is kind of the stigma they receive from other people in terms of the relationship, therefore not being valid, not being a real relationship. Oh, if you found the right person, then you would be monogamous, or something like that, which is insulting, honestly.
Well, and I also see that, again, these stigmas that can be cultural, because again, we came from a puritanical culture, that, even in consensual non-monogamy, there's just sort of like, you're doing what? Like, it's because it's outside of quote unquote what is normative, but it's to recognize what was isn't what is, and certainly isn't what's going to be. And we have more permission and freedom now than ever to really be true to ourselves. And again, discovering your own turn-ons and what gives us pleasure.
And we're seeing such a increase, at least in people reporting ethical non-monogamy. I think that's or maybe there are just potentially more studies going on. But the numbers I'm seeing now, it's 5 to 10% of couples exist in some form of ethical non-monogamy, which is extremely high. That's roughly kind of the numbers they use to describe the number of LGBTQ people, in the population as well. So I think that would have just been something I would have loved to hear, that there are other options. And there was someone, I was talking to Robin Oakes a while ago, and she's this big bisexual activist and icon. And she spoke about, polyamory and ethical non-monogamy in regards to bisexuality. But I remember a phrase that I think she coined, so I want to credit her, which she called radical monogamy, as opposed to this idea of kind of passive monogamy. So it's hey, I've decided to be monogamous, not because it is the norm, not as because the standard, not because religion told me that this is the only valid type of relationship I can be in. I'm monogamous because this is the relationship I think that would work best for me and my partner, and this is something that I would like to do. And I think hearing that would have been so, from a young age would have been so important, just to question monogamy a little bit as just being the normal standard. And after you question it, if you're no, this is still exactly what I want, then of course go and get it. But radical monogamy versus, I think she said reflexive monogamy, which was kind of the passive version, which I thought was cool.
Well, I think what's important about that is, because I see this so much in couples and relationships, because again, people don't teach us about relationships any more than they teach us about sex, is that they just don't know how to sort of communicate about these things with one another. And so it doesn't even enter the conversation. And that another piece I just want to make sure that we could get to before we get to Q&A, is, the potential role of pain or discomfort that some people sometimes have around sex. So I just want anybody listening to know, sex should never be painful. When, if it is, go right to your gynecologist. You might need to be seeing a urologist. But that sex, some people almost are taught, these myths or otherwise, that, it's just going to hurt. And I think we do everybody a disservice in that. So I just wanted to make sure that anybody listening, if anybody who has any pain or discomfort around sex, that they may need to see a pelvic floor therapist, definitely talking to the gynecologist and potentially even a sex therapist. But that I just want to make sure that in the sex edu conversation, we talk a little bit about the role of pain. Not when it's eroticizing to be a DSM content.
Yeah, that pain you like. That's the good type of pain. This is the bad type of pain here. And the same thing is true for anal sex. I get so many people, especially who are new to it, who are like, hey, is it common to bleed a lot afterwards? And I'm like, yeah, that means you didn't use enough lube. It means you didn't go slowly enough. And if this is something that keeps happening, of course you need to see your doctor. But I want to be like, was this pleasurable? He's like, it was pretty painful. I'm like, no, that's not what it should be. Anal sex should not be painful. Yes, it maybe takes a little bit more getting used to, but if you're like, no, you should not be bleeding after, you should not be in pain. This should be pleasurable.
Information.
And I think that kind of speaks to the lack of information, at least I would have really appreciated around queer, just like how queer people have sex and queer sexuality. Which was something that was not discussed at all in my sex education. I think it was just gay people do exist and they do have sex, and that's it. And that was the end of that. And it was all probably in the larger context of HIV would have been the only thing, which is really honestly stigmatizing. That in of itself, that's a different conversation. I was thinking about this. It wasn't until my senior year of college where I had multiple gay best friends, and even I was closeted at the time and hooking up with guys. But it was my senior year, and I was living with one of my best friends who was gay, and I made a joke, and he said something like, "Do you not realize that gay men can have sex in a position other than doggy style?" And I was like, "What?" I did not know. For some reason, I thought that was the only position, like given the anatomy and how it would work, which obviously is not true at all. But I just think of that. Yeah, I knew nothing about queer sexuality, how to engage in anal sex, and also just learning about sexual fluidity, I think would have been so helpful for me. I don't think the word bisexual or even transgender was mentioned in my high school at all. And I think normalizing sexual fluidity, normalizing exploration. I think one thing I would love if education can do this is being like, hey, you can try out hooking up with a guy, and that doesn't even necessarily make you gay. It doesn't make you bi. You could be curious and do it and not like it. The same thing could happen, for women or transgender people or non-binary people. I feel like right now, this maybe speaks to a larger thing in society, but we don't encourage sexual exploration or sexual fluidity. And if you're a guy, and let's say you get drunk and make out with a guy once, then, oh, you must be labeled gay for the rest of your life. So I really wish, versus if you're a woman who makes out with another woman drunk, like, oh, you're probably not bi or lesbian, you're probably straight too. But
so there's definitely education around that. Joe Court is a psychologist on the West Coast who speaks a lot to that. Again, straight guys who sometimes experiment, and again, taking all the stigma and stuff out of it, and just, maybe defining for people sexual fluidity, because not necessarily everybody recognizes that, the idea there is that throughout your lifespan, it's not about gender, it's about person. And you might be sexually attracted to somebody who maybe a woman and or a man. And that, anyway, helping people realize that and have the permission to do that exploration. And then the last thing I wanted to quickly do psychoeducationally before we go to Q&A is I've often heard a lot about they wish they got more contraception options in sex ed, because, IUDs in terms, especially hormonal versus non-hormonal IUDs, condoms, even condoms for women, that the Plan B, that we really do help educate women and feel more empowered to, if they're not choosing to get pregnant, that they know all the different options, because especially hormonal contraceptives, they can cut free testosterone in half. And so for some women, they find that really can impact desire. So again, that's not true for all women, but again, if somebody may be struggling and they're on a birth control, it's certainly another conversation to definitely have with their gynecologist.
Absolutely. And actually, let's do the questions. Let's see here.
One of them was go ahead.
No, go for it.
Well, one of them was, at what age should you have a discussion of sex ed and how to introduce it at age appropriate levels? Gail Saltz has written a great book. As American Girl has a great book for young women. The idea is you start young. I think a big thing is you call it a vulva, a vagina, not the down there, my private part. I mean, again, the shame that people don't often even use explicit anatomy. So you start at a very young age, and that when someone's exploring themselves, you're just that's perfectly fine. Normalize it. It's just something you do in private. And it's sort of something that's an ongoing conversation. It's not one definitive one that you have. And I gave you a little bit of resources, but definitely go online, because they're really great books, for exactly the age that your children are. Yeah,
that's right. And I see another question here. I know you talked about sex education in school, but I want to become a teacher and also teach sex ed. What's one or a few things you wish I and others could incorporate in the curriculum? I know we kind of spoke about this a lot, but one thing I didn't mention that I would love to see in the curriculum from especially younger age is discussions on enthusiastic consent. I didn't learn about enthusiastic consent till well after college. I was just taught consent means no, and that's it. And you kind of go until you receive a no. And that's a really unhealthy, inappropriate, and really messed up way to approach engaging in sexual relationships or any relationship with anyone, even outside of sexual context. But just with the idea of enthusiastic consent is you get this big yes. You get this, I really want to do this too. And understanding how consent doesn't transfer between experiences. If you had consent once, that doesn't mean that you get consent again. Because you have consent for one action doesn't automatically mean you have consent for another action. And so I think just a much more nuanced understanding of consent and a much more enthusiastic conversation about consent would have been so helpful, especially at this age point. I think it's so important to have these conversations before you go off to college.
Absolutely, when you're young. And again, one of my friend's daughters was saying that the college did a education that they had to do before getting there that covered consent and covered things like alcohol, right? And conditions, right? That can change somebody's capacity for consent. And as you said, it can change over time. And a resource people always recommend people check out is Consent is Tea. It's a video on YouTube and it's really fabulous because it's like, I mean, we're not allowed to curse, but it's like, yes, enthusiastically, I want tea. But by the time you go to make it and I'm like no longer interested in tea, or just because you want it on Tuesday doesn't mean you want it on Thursday. So there's certainly something, I think we should all do a lot more education and just like conversations, because it's one of the questions, but like, how do you talk about, looking and taking, getting any testing, right, for STIs, that, because again, those can be awkward conversations, but I'm like, it's part of a sexual health conversation. You just sort of normalize it. And it's not this awkward thing. It's like kind of proud, like, hey, I'd be happy to go do that with you. Because it's, again, about creating a sense of safety and building trust with a partner. And so if you're both invested in each other's sexual health, then why would you not really look forward to doing testing? And right now they have so many, you can do home testing. So if the stigma is you don't want to go to a lab or put it through insurance, you can absolutely get some great testing and get the results getting it from home. Oh, and then there was another question here, which I definitely want, because we have some toys and stuff that we could say, but like practical advice, because sort of like peeing after sex to decrease the chance of UTI, 100%. Definitely pee after sex, unless you're trying to get pregnant, in which case you might want to put your feet up a little bit. And that, again, for many women as they get older, and it does generally take women longer to get aroused, the role of lubricants, right? So, I mean, Lovehoney has not only their great general lubricants, but they even have the flavored ones. This is the cherry, they have strawberry. Like, lube is your friend. And they also have, because I want to talk about the Ignite, which is an arousing, stimulating gel. Again, I think women are always looking for, like, when you're owning your own pleasure, what is it that I can do to help facilitate my own turn on? And this very warm, tingling sensation is definitely something, if you haven't, I would definitely recommend you try.
And yeah, this leads into the next question is how do we incorporate the benefits of sex toys into young adults' education? I think, first of all, just explicitly saying this, that this is an option, and really I think removing the stigma from sex toys. I mean, up until recently, when I thought of like a masturbator, I like had this like really kind of like negative idea of this 50-year-old virgin who lives in his mom's basement and they're the ones using the fleshlight for like 40 years. And kind of, that's a really damaging, stigmatizing thing for how you understand sex toys. And I think there's this idea of you only have sex toys if you're a man, if you're not having sex, which is ridiculous because sex toys should be involved while you're having sex with your partner, also while having sex alone.
And some of those sleeves, not to cut you off, can actually help people learn ejaculatory control, right? That there's many benefits. And I think it's so great that you brought that up, because I think there's such a negative sort of association of, you don't have a partner, or you're kind of like in the basement, versus, again, as what we're talking about, which is like owning shoulders back, like, let me try this. Why would I not? Like, we know what we know. We don't know what we don't know.
And it's so important for like an introduction. Oh, one thing I didn't discuss, oh my God, how I wish I learned in Sex Ed is prostate stimulation and prostate play. I don't believe I forgot to bring that up, because that is personally my favorite thing. And what I write about at Men's Health all the time is just being like, fellas, it does not make you gay if you like prostate stimulation. We literally have, the prostate has as many nerve endings, roughly a little bit less than the clitoris, just to give you a sense of how sensitive that it actually is. It can lead to incredible full body orgasms as opposed to just kind of localized genital orgasms. And I really wish like they spoke about like, yeah, just prostate stimulation in men, and speaking of which, like how to douche, how to clean. I mean, that is a question I get all the darn time. And that's something that they should teach in school. If that is something that's important, because if you clean incorrectly, that becomes a physical health issue. If you think to clean with warm water or hot water and you burn your insides, if you use essential oils, if you over douche and therefore get rid of the rectal lining inside of your anus or your rectum, like that's very bad. So this is literally a physical health issue. But I bring this up in response to the kind of toy question is because of prostate massagers. And that is one thing that I absolutely love to use. And the one that I specifically use is actually the Desire from Lovehoney. And I like this one because it also has this actually goes and stimulates your perineum, which is like commonly called like the taint or grundle. And that is like a highly erogenous zone that actually feels really good when stimulated, and we don't think to do that. So I love this one. And then I also love...
That's what I want to just say, because that toy can also be used for vaginal and G-spot stim. So you get to decide which direction you kind of want to play with it. So I don't want to cut you off, but I definitely want to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I really like the cock ring that Lovehoney has, which also has the rabbit on top of it. And I mean, the thing about cock rings and the thing about sex toys, I think in particular, let's get this up here. It really does look like a rabbit. It's so funny. And this one also has one for just wrap around your testicles as well, if you want to do that, or you can do both around your penis. But one thing I love about sex toys, and I always emphasize it, is like it does things that your partner cannot and will never be able to do. Can your partner vibrate? No, your partner can never vibrate, so don't be threatened by that. That's also why you need to include these into your everyday life. And I always love having a prostate massager in, and I always recommend this for everyone when you're having either vaginal or anal sex with someone else. So just have that prostate massager inside of you, and you'll just see how insane your orgasms become. Yeah, that was like a long sex toy rant spiel, but
Well, again, there's so much about this, like in terms of cleaning them, right, and air drying them, make sure like the storing care, right, of your sex toys, and what kind of lubes you should be using, whether, again, it's a silicone-based toy. Again, I think all of us really need more education. And even when we're talking about sex toys, I have so many clients, it's like, I don't want to go into a store. And like Babeland and some of these stores are amazing. And Lovehoney, like you get to go online. And I encourage my couples to do this all the time, and individuals, but like, just be curious. Like, look at all the different kinds of sex toys, right? There's everything from the like vibrators. This one is the Ignite, which is a big fan of mine. Again, it is waterproof. It is small and discreet. It's pretty quiet. Again, 2/3 of women do not orgasm with clitoral, with penetration alone, right? They need additional clitoral stimulation. So the cock ring vibrator, little bullet vibrators, really wonderful resources. And again, it's not to feel threatened. I've had some men sort of feel threatened by a sex toy. It's to realize your intention is because I want to give my partner pleasure. And as you're saying, there's certain things you just can't do. You know what I mean? But why would you cut her off from the additional pleasure if you're open to the kind of play that you both could have together?
Yeah. I want to make sure you guys can still hear me because I heard my AirPod is starting to die, but we're all set.
I can still hear you.
Okay, perfect. I thought this was a great question. How should we define sex? I'll let you take it away.
I don't think the part of thing I want to say is it's just like I believe this concept, you are your own expert. In some ways, you get to define for yourself what is sex, because some people may continue to feel it is sort of penis in vagina, and others, Bill Clinton sort of coined that oral sex, is a version of sex, which before we weren't usually talking about it in that regard. And so, it's often about a feeling and an energy and an intention. But I think that it's the kind of thing that allow yourself to be a researcher and define it for yourself. And the range of what it can be.
I think it's so many different things for so many people. There's a significant group of gay men who do not like anal sex. They never do. And so, but if that's the definition of what sex is to you, then these people are never having sex. And that's just not true. I think being inclusive, much more of just kind of intimacy as a part of sex, and less so just on the physical desires. If you're someone who's part of maybe physically disabled or part of the disabled community, something like, or differently abled, then you might not be physically able to have penis and vagina sex. That still doesn't mean you're not having sex. So I think I really love your definition of just being like, define what it is for you. And just know that it's
and then it changes over the lifespan, right? Because as we age, there's endocrine hormonal changes. There can be medications like antidepressants, SSRIs, well-known sexual side effects. Again, people have radiation, who have surgery, who have cancer. Like a lot of things, chronic pain can impact our desire and our expression of sex and sexuality. And so I think, again, it's that fluid concept. Just be where you are now, and where you are now, go to Lovehoney and all these other, amazing resources to be like, how do I capitalize, right, on what's possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have like 3 or so more minutes left. So I'm just going to take a quick scroll through here, and you can too, Megan, to see if there's any questions that kind of stick out that we haven't quite discussed.
Well, for the one which was our start was how do I become a sex educator? Again, the greatest resource for that is the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. That's asec.org. By state, for anybody who's looking for a sex therapist, they tell you who's qualified, which is, again, a great resource. And then also what are the training, CEs, hours of supervision, all that you need to become a really great and qualified and they have it, you can be a counselor, you can be an educator, they're different tracks.
That's incredible. Yeah, absolutely. And let's see, probably time for one more. Why
don't we take I don't know if we covered it earlier, but how do we normalize masturbation? It's not dirty or shameful. It's to realize, I think, if we educate from the very beginning, like in utero, right? You can, with a sonogram, see that touching yourself, playing with yourself is just, kind of hardwired. I sort of say we're hardwired for pleasure. And interestingly enough, Pope Francis just recently said that sex is a divine pleasure. So I'll just throw that in, because I think sometimes guilt can get in the way of even, and again, the role of masturbation and what's allowed, right? And so I think the more that we think of it as self-sex, self-pleasuring, and the most important thing about it is, how do you communicate to a partner what you know and love if you don't know what it is for yourself? And I sort of really encourage what I call like pleasure practices and play practices, so that you can learn that. But I think you normalize it by having the conversations and recognizing that we're hardwired to feel pleasure in our bodies. And this is just one way we can do that.
And I think having the conversations, before, your first sex ed class in high school, because people are clearly masturbating before then. So if you let them know, like, this is something that's natural, this is normal. And just knowing that I think that it exists is super important, because when you find out about it on your own, it's very confusing. It's very shameful. You don't know that this is a thing. So I think, having that conversations, maybe a little bit earlier on, but I think also just on the topic of masturbation, we can conclude with this. I always recommend that people watch their partners masturbate and masturbate next to each other. And I know you're kind of speaking about this too. And I think it really helps you learn what it is that your partner likes. They can learn what it is that you like. You can see their technique. You get really turned on watching them. They get really turned on watching you. There's an element of kind of foreplay and teasing, but sometimes people will say like, oh, I'm not exactly sure what I like, and which can be frustrating for you, the partner, being like, okay, well, I'm trying to figure this out. I'm trying to communicate and you're not giving me anything. Okay, well, if you're not sure how to describe it to me, hey, why don't you do it to yourself and I can watch from that. I wouldn't necessarily frame it like that, but like, hey, let's masturbate together. And then you can see what your partner does and then imitate those and replicate those, especially if they're having a hard time like verbally explaining what it is exactly that they like.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to sort of end on, the potential role of mutual masturbation. Again, no performance pressure, you're giving yourselves pleasure, you're having orgasms in front of each other, which again is good for your body and your health and your mind and your well-being. And so, it's always about thinking out of the box. And I hope we're highlighting that there's a lot we didn't get in sex ed, but there's some amazing and great sex educators and counselors and therapists out there. So if anybody's ever struggling or has questions, just start to do some research. And certainly ASECT is a wonderful resource as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. In 10 minutes, the next session is every tip that you guys need for dorm room sex, which is definitely something I wish I had, was taught when I was 17. So definitely stay tuned for that. But if you exit out at the top, and then you can go back and potentially join another workshop if you want to do that as well. But again, my name is Zane. I was joined by Dr. Megan Fleming. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, again, I just want to say, I hope you stay on for the next, and pick your next workshop. I'm going to be doing the next one about the dorm room sex with Kenzie, and it's going to be, anyway, I hope people stick around for that. We'll be on in like—
Oh, you're the one, sorry, Megan. Megan's the one doing it. You guys should 100% stick around. That was, yes.
It's all good. But, listen, do what speaks to you, because there are other great workshops happening as well. So anyway, I'm really thankful that Lovehoney put this together, because it's brought together a lot of people in a community, I think, to normalize these conversations and to inspire people to realize what's possible. Because I think so many, I call it foreclosure of imagination. People get stuck and they get in ruts and they stop trying. And so I always say, go out and try something new, and try again.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye, guys. This was a lot of fun.